Welcome to the concluding lecture in my series, The Theology of the American Revolution. I will have some closing remarks at the end. So for our last installment, we're going to go to what I believe to be a rather fitting place. We started during the French and Indian War with this series, going up through the Revolution to the Constitutional Convention, and now we will be ending with the book Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville was a French scholar who traveled to America in the 1830s. And this gave him a unique window into understanding what the founding was all about. Because we had seen democracy play out now for a while. And this is before the escalation into the Civil War that saw a re-examination of a lot of the core truths that the country was founded on. This is the book. As you can see, it's pretty big. I read about a third of it back when I was a freshman in college, and then I had to stop, and I'll tell you why I had to stop. I have an immense amount of respect for Alexis de Tocqueville, and it comes down to how he writes. When I read this book, I was a political science student taking many classes in the field, and I was mystified when I first read Tocqueville that it seems like a page, just one page of that book, is enough to base an entire week's worth of class lectures on. It truly is incredible how he writes. It truly is incredible how he thinks. So, we are going to be examining the beginning of the introduction to this book. And I'm going to give you a little insight into what I just said, because we're going to go through this where I'm going to read a text, a quote from a paragraph, and then we're going to talk about it. We're going to move through until the conclusion. Starting off, in the very beginning, Tocqueville says, "I readily discovered the prodigious influence which this primary fact exercises on the whole course of society, by giving a certain direction to public opinion and a certain tenor of the laws, by imparting new maxims to the governing powers and peculiar habits to the governed." Tocqueville is talking about the equality of conditions. When he went to America, he was completely stunned by how equal the society was. Christendom, and really all society, going back up until this era in history, was not equal. There was a distinction between the aristocracy and the peasant class. And these class divides dictated everything. Tocqueville remarks that upon going to America, he has found an exception to this rule that has remained constant all throughout the history of human affairs. Next paragraph. "I observe that the equality of conditions is daily progressing towards those extreme limits which it seems to have reached in the United States, and that the democracy which governs the American communities appears to be rapidly rising into power in Europe." Tocqueville was French, and he observed this same phenomenon that was taking place. Remember, that looked new, happening in Christendom, happening all across the developing world. Moving on to the next paragraph. "Soon, however, the power of the clergy was founded and began to exert itself. The clergy opened its ranks to all classes, to the poor and the rich, the villein and the lord. Equality penetrated into the government through the church, and the being who was a serf must have vegetated in perpetual bondage, took his place as a priest in the midst of nobles, and not infrequently above the heads of kings." Isn't that language just awesome? So what Tocqueville is talking about here in this paragraph is he goes back 700 years in history, and he begins to trace back this pattern where 700 years ago there was a clear aristocracy. There was clear hereditary lineage where land, political power passed down within select families, and the serf, the peasant, the average citizen, had no access to this power. And this was the state of affairs. But with the introduction of the clergy, this is the church, we saw the first crack in this aristocratic framework, wherein someone of poor origins could join the clergy and rise through the ranks of society to become equal with the nobles, equal with the king, or perhaps superior to the king as the church's importance in society expanded. So on this same vein, Tocqueville, the value attached to the privileges of birth decreased in the exact proportion in which new paths were struck out to advancement. So in this paragraph, Tocqueville goes through, we started with the clergy, now we're going to talk about a list of new introductions that started to change the power dynamic in Christendom. So they talk about these different relations of men led to a more complicated society where you needed more legal structures that afforded more opportunity and access to the people. We also saw the introduction of commerce. Commerce provided any citizen with the means to gain economic agency and wealth, and then of course, with wealth, you can then wield political influence. The financiers, the hated financiers of Christendom, began to rise up to a position of societal prominence because it was their financing that enabled the commerce that funded the government. And with this, the fine arts, the sciences, all of these societal human advancements began to be democratized down to the level of the citizen. Back to Tocqueville. The taste for luxury, the love of war, the sway of fashion, and the most superficial as well as the deepest passions of the human heart cooperated to enrich the poor and impoverish the rich. So as this feudal system is breaking down, as society, the people, are gaining access to money and technology and art and culture, we see this power dynamic we've been talking about start to shift, where the more agency the people have, the less agency the nobility has, as power is democratized. Now, going back to Tocqueville. Poetry, eloquence, and memory, the grace of wit, the glow of imagination, the depth of thought, and all gifts which are bestowed by Providence with an equal hand, turn to the advantage of democracy. So now we're living in a more technologically advanced society with more complicated business and more complicated commerce. All of a sudden, it means something to be smart. It means something to be capable. Tocqueville makes the point that Providence has bestowed upon mankind all these gifts in an equal manner. This cuts against the traditional orthodoxy of the aristocratic age, because that would have put the aristocrat in a fundamentally different and elevated class in relation to the citizenry. What Tocqueville is saying here is that all these gifts, wit, memory, eloquence, are bestowed equally amongst the citizenry, and we're just starting to see the development of an economy, a legal system, and governments that are able to tap into these gifts. Moving on, Tocqueville. The noble has gone down on the social ladder and the routier gone up. One descends as the other rises. And in this paragraph, Tocqueville takes us through a chronological history of how this power of the noble class is starting to fall away. This starts with the Crusades, which dethroned nobles and divided up their power. Communities began to introduce their own political order. So we have self-determination, political self-determination in a local place within a feudal monarchical society. That's a contradiction. Firearms, perfect example. This made the average peasant equal to the lord on the battlefield. This cuts against the knights we see in movies with the armor and the training and all that stuff. With firearms, everybody's equal. And the printing press democratized information. So now these citizens are gaining access to the exact same information as the nobles, which levels the playing field. And finally, with the Protestant Reformation, which we've talked about on this channel before, salvation was offered to everybody. not just those who could pay for it. Moving on, Tocqueville shows that this pattern is everywhere. And this is where we begin to introduce the theological argument he is making. Tocqueville establishes that this equality of conditions is now the textbook case in Christendom, and he argues that everybody who's helped to make it happen and everybody who sought to destroy it have been blind instruments in the hand of God. This is our theological argument. Tocqueville is arguing that God's will is being expressed in the organization of society, and whether you like his will or whether you don't, there's not much you can do about it. We're going to develop this argument for the rest of the talk. So, reading from the next paragraph, the gradual development of equality of conditions is therefore a providential fact, and it possesses all characteristics of a divine decree. It is universal, it is durable, it constantly eludes all human interference. And I don't know if I've heard a better description of God's will. So what Tocqueville is arguing is that this is God's will. This is an endemic condition that is being brought upon the society of man. And it seems divine on its face, because he's saying it's not debatable or negotiable or a matter of opinion. He's saying this is where history is going. It is universal, it is everywhere. It is durable, it can't be stopped. And it eludes all human interference, which doesn't God's will usually do. And then finally, onto the last paragraph in the first part of the introduction. This is the theological climax of the piece. It is not necessary that God himself should speak in order to disclose to us the unquestionable signs of his will. We can discern them in the habitual course of nature and in the invariable tendency of events. I know, without a special revelation, that the planets move in orbits traced by the Creator's finger. But what Tocqueville is arguing here is that God's will is clear. He is suggesting that we can infer God's will from an analysis of the habitual course of nature, which is the condition of society and how it's advanced up until this point. And in the same way, we can say that the planets trace the path marked by the Creator's finger. We can say that God's will is present in society, in the equality of conditions, and that man is converging on that point, whether he is for it or against it. And he closes this paragraph by saying, to attempt to check democracy would be in that case to resist the will of God. Isn't that language awesome? I think it's just awesome. So Tocqueville's argument, the equality of conditions is the will of God, will be the last point in our series on the theology of the American Revolution. We have taken this all the way from 1755 with the Battle of the Monongahela, all the way forward now to a scholar writing about the ethos of the founding of this country and saying that it is God's will that society be organized this way. The same God is ordering our society today. And just to conclude, this series has meant a lot to me. This is where my head was at when I was 17, before my life took a turn on a different direction. And I consider it an immense blessing that I'm having a dream from my teenage years come true today. Thank you, and God bless.